Welcome to our study of the book of Daniel. It's been a while since we looked at the book of Daniel, and if you look at this sheet that says God controls history on the top, let's do a quick review. What we did this past summer is we looked at the first 6 chapters of the book of Daniel. But I want you to see how it's divided, because Daniel is a very unique book. Daniel is divided where it starts off in the Hebrew language for the first chapter and 4 verses, and then chapter 2, verse 4, way down to chapter 7, it's in Aramaic. That's a totally different language. And then from chapter 8, verse 1 to chapter 12, verse 13, it's in Hebrew again. And one of the reasons was that they wanted people who spoke Aramaic to know the stories between chapter 2 and chapter 6. But I also want you to notice that in chapter 2 to 7, there is what you call a chiastic structure. It looks like an X cut in half. So you get ABC, and then you get CBA instead of ABCD. You get ABC and then CBA. So look at the parallels between them. Under number 1, Dreams and Defiance, written in Aramaic, Daniel interpreted Nebuchadnezzar's dream in chapter 2. And in chapter 7, Daniel has his own dream, but that dream is very similar to the dream in chapter 2. So there's a connection between chapter 2 and chapter 7. It's a dream about history on both sides. Then in chapter 3, Daniel Daniel's friends refuse to worship refused to worship the image. And in chapter 6, Daniel refused to pray to the king. And both groups, Daniel and his friends, were rescued. So there's a parallel between chapter 3 and chapter 6. And then if you go to the center, chapter 4 and chapter 5, Daniel interpreted Nebuchadnezzar's dream, and it was about God judging him because pride goes before a fall. And in chapter 5, God judges Belshazzar, the successor to Nebuchadnezzar. So you see there's a parallel between chapter 2 and 7, chapter 3 and chapter 6, and chapter 4 and chapter 5. Why is that important? Because when we look at chapter 7, it's very important that we remember chapter 2. And that's why I gave you the second piece of paper that I handed out. And it looks a little bit like this. Do you remember what we learned in chapter 2? That huge statue that was made by Nebuchadnezzar. And there was the head of gold, and that was to represent Babylon. And then there were the arms and chest of silver, and that was to represent the Medes and the Persians. Do you remember this? Is this coming back to you? You've seen it before? And then there was the middle section of bronze, and that represented Greece. And then there was the iron legs that represented the Empire of Rome. And interesting, there was a gap between the legs, and on the feet there were 10 toes, and we didn't really learn what the 10 toes were about. Well, we're going to learn about them in chapter 7, okay? But they aren't going to be 10 toes this time. They're going to be 10 horns. but the 10 toes and the 10 horns are about the same thing. This is symbolic language. So, with that kind of an introduction, let me keep on introducing. I told you the Hebrew and Aramaic of the various chapters. Daniel 7 is seen as a parallel to Daniel chapter 2. The difference is that Nebuchadnezzar had the dream in chapter 2, and Daniel was the one who had the dream in chapter 7. But both dreams are about the future of world history. Stop right there. When I say both dreams are about the future of world history, I'm saying they're about the future of world history for Daniel, not necessarily for us. Why? Because Daniel wrote this when he was living in the Babylonian Empire. He hadn't seen the Medes and the Persians yet. He hadn't seen Greece yet. He hadn't seen Rome yet. It hadn't happened yet. So for Daniel, these were all future when he wrote this book. But for us, there are some things that are still future, and that we'll talk about a little later. So there's a little bit that's future for us, but a lot that was future for Daniel when he wrote it. Okay? So that's why verse 1 is very important, and I want to read it for you. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream, and visions passed through his mind, and he was lying on his bed. He wrote down the substance of his dream. Now I have a question. Yes? Daniel chapter 7? Or are you in Daniel chapter 8? You're on chapter 8. Yeah, okay. Daniel chapter 7 says the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon. Okay. When you read just that first verse, what do you notice about how it was written? It wasn't written in the first person, was it? It was written in the third person as if somebody else is talking about Daniel. It's not Daniel talking, it's somebody else talking about Daniel. And that's important. And it talks about the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon. Well, if you look back to chapter 6, who was the king of Babylon? It was Darius. Who was Darius? He was a Mede. Go back to chapter 5. Who was the king of Babylon? Belshazzar. But what year of his reign was it? It was the very final day of his reign. When you come to chapter 7, historically, chapter 7 fits after chapter 4. You remember the parallel chapters that I talked about before? In order to get those parallel chapters, they messed up with the chronology. It's more important to them to communicate parallel themes than to have every chapter in chronological order. So, when you read chapter 7, historically, chapter 7 happened before chapter 5. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, so the timing is important. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon. And this was 10 years before the events of chapter 5. And the person is Daniel. And the event is that Daniel had a dream. Visions passed through his head. He was lying on his bed, and he wrote down the substance of his dream. Now, the very fact that Daniel wrote down his dream in that time period was was kind of like a insurance that if it didn't happen, that could be proved. And if it did happen, it could be proved that he wrote it down before it happened. Okay? So that's the introduction. As soon as you get to chapter 7, verse 2, Daniel speaks in the first person. And he speaks in the first person through the whole rest of the chapter. The only comment about Daniel from the third person is verse 1. From now on, from verse 2 on, Daniel is has written down and he's speaking about his personal experience. So I want to read for you chapter 7, verses 2 to 14. Daniel chapter 7. Daniel said, "In my vision at night, I looked, and there before me were the four winds of heaven, churning up the great sea. Four great beasts, each different from the others, came up out of the sea. The first was like a lion, and it had wings, the wings of an eagle. I watched until its wings were torn off, and it was lifted from the ground, so that it stood on 2 feet like a man, and the heart of a man was given to it. And there before me was a second beast, which looked like a bear. It was raised up on one of its sides, and it had 3 ribs in its mouth. Between its teeth, it was told, 'Get up and eat your fill of flesh.' After that I looked, and there before me was another beast, one that looked like a leopard, and on its back it had 4 wings, like those of a bird. The beast had 4 heads, and it was given authority to rule. After that, in my vision at night, I looked, and there before me was a 4th beast, terrifying and frightening and very powerful. It had large iron teeth, and it crushed and devoured its victims, and trampled underfoot whatever was left. It was different from all the former beasts, and it had 10 horns. While I was thinking about the horns, there before me was another horn, a little horn, which came up among them, and 3 of the first horns were uprooted before it. This horn had eyes which looked like the eyes of a man, and a mouth that spoke boastfully. As I looked, thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was as white as snow. The hair of his head was white like wool. His throne was flaming with fire, and its wheels were all ablaze. A river of fire was flowing, coming out from before him. Thousands upon thousands attended him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated, and the books were open. Then I continued to watch because of the boastful words the horn was speaking. I kept looking until the beast was slain and its body destroyed and thrown into blazing fire. The other beasts had been stripped of their authority, but were allowed to live for a period of time. In my vision at night, I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All peoples, nations, and men of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. May God bless this reading of his word. So Daniel described the dream that he had. This is not Nebuchadnezzar's dream. It has some parallel ideas, but it's different than Nebuchadnezzar's dream, even though the ideas are parallel. Nebuchadnezzar had his dream, and his dream was about a statue that had different kinds of metals. Daniel had a dream, and his dream was about different kinds of animals. Now I want you to think for a moment. Different kinds of animals are used to describe different countries even today. If you talk about Russia, what animal do you think about? A bear. If you think of the United States of America, what do you think about? An eagle. Now, see if I can test you a little bit. If you think of Canada, what do you think about? A beaver. A beaver. Look on its coins. Anyways, so Daniel starts verses 2 to 6 by saying, "In my vision at night I looked." And Daniel is going to say that 3 times. He says it in verse 2, "In my vision at night I looked." He says it in verse 7, "In my vision at night I looked." And he says it again in verse, let's see, I don't have it right. Oh, verse 13, "In my vision at night I looked." So he's describing his vision in 3 separate sections. First of all, verses 2 to 6, "There were 4 winds of heaven, and they were churning up the sea." Now, because of where he lives, it's most likely that he was talking about the Mediterranean Sea. So these 4 winds from heaven were churning up the sea. And I was privileged to be in Israel and in January, and when the weather gets stormy and that sea starts to churn up, it looks very frightening. So I can imagine what he's seeing. There were 4 winds of heaven, and they were churning up the great sea. And there were 4 great beasts. They were different from each other, and they were coming out of the sea. Just for fun at home, I'm not going to do much right now, but look up chapter 13 of Revelation. And there is a beast that comes out of the sea. And the beast that comes out of the sea is similar in description to Daniel's 4th beast. So for fun tonight, you can read Revelation chapter 13, starting with verse 1. So now he's going to describe the beasts. The first beast is described in verse 4. The beast was like a lion, and it had the wings of an eagle. And you look on the historical diagrams about the city of Babylon and the kingdom of Babylon, and that was their symbol. Their symbol was a lion, and their lion had wings like an eagle. So it describes what was actually happening in that day, their mascot, if you will. They were describing this lion with wings like an eagle. That's what Daniel's describing here, and he means Babylon. And he says about this that the wings were torn off. Do you remember something about the story of Nebuchadnezzar where his wings got clipped? Remember that he was lifted up in pride and he actually acted like an animal for a while? That's his wings getting clipped. Okay? And it says his wings were torn off, and then it was lifted up to stand on 2 feet. After he became a beast, God gave him, 7 years later, God gave him strength again to stand like a man. So this is a description of that episode. So those wings were torn off. It was lifted up to stand on 2 feet, and the mind of a human was given to it. That's a description of the story we know from earlier on in the book of Daniel, the story of Nebuchadnezzar. Then in verse 5, he goes on to talk about a second beast. And this beast looked like a bear. It was raised up on one side. What was the second kingdom that Daniel talked about? He talked about the Medes and the Persians. The Persians were always stronger than the Medes. That's why this bear is raised up on one side. And incidentally, just like the lion with eagle's wings was part of the symbolism for Babylon, the bear was the symbol for the Medes and the Persians. So this bear was raised up on one side, and it had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. Do you know what is known about the Medes and the Persians? They conquered 3 major kingdoms. They conquered Babylon, they conquered Egypt, and I think the third one, if I remember right, is Lydia, something like that. And so that's the symbol of these 3 ribs in its mouth, and it was told to get up and eat your flesh. So there's the kingdom of Babylon. It lasts for a certain amount of time, and then we read about it in chapter 5 of Daniel. Then the Medes and the Persians come in and destroy everything that was Babylon, and the Medes and the Persians rule for a couple of 100 years. And after the Medes and the Persians come, there's another power. And that power is told us about in the third beast, verse 6. It had 4 wings on its back like a bird, and it had 4 heads. What an ugly looking beast, huh? And it was given authority to rule. And again, the leopard is the symbol of Greece. And what does it mean when it says that it had 4 wings? Well, if you have 2 wings, it's a symbol of speed. But 4 wings, it's like double power, double speed, extra speed. So this leopard has extra speed, and it had 4 heads. And whenever you hear of heads in this chapter, it's talking about leaders of the kingdoms. And you know what happened? When Greece came in, it came in initially under the power of a man named Alexander the Great. But after Alexander the Great died, and he died very young, I think he was in his 30s. After he died, there were 4 leaders that took his place. So it says right here, it had 4 heads, and it was given authority to rule. Why do you think this is so important? It's important because Daniel saw these kingdoms and these leaders and how they would be characterized hundreds of years before they happened. If I lived in the United States, or what we call the United States, in the 1600s, and I predicted that George Washington would be the first president of the United States. And not only that, I predicted that in 2000, whoever it was would be president of the United States. I've forgotten who it was, I'm sorry. But you would say, wow, if he was predicting that in 1600, that's amazing God-given ability. Well, that's what's happening with Daniel right here. He's predicting 200 and 400 and 600 years ahead of time these different kingdoms that would come in the world. And how is he able to predict that? They were dreams that were given by God. And in fact, it is such an amazing thing that Daniel could see these dreams of these kingdoms ahead of time. We look back on them and we say, that's history. But the people who don't believe in God say, Daniel wasn't written in the year of Belshazzar. Daniel was written 400 years later, where he could look back on all these kingdoms. Why? Because they don't believe that God has the power to show history beforehand. So, those are the first three beasts. And if you look on your picture, you can see how they line up. Babylon is the head of gold, and Babylon is the first beast, the lion. Medes and the Persians were the silver, and Medes and the Persians were the bear. Greece was the bronze, and Greece was the leopard. So far we got the whole thing matched up. Then in verse 7 to 12, he says, the fourth beast was terrifying. In fact, in verse 7, he says, after that in my vision, I looked, and there before me was a fourth beast, terrifying and frightening and very powerful. This is a scary beast, worse than the others. And what was his characteristic? It had large iron teeth. You say, oh, it must have had false teeth. They were iron, huh? But if you look into it, Daniel chapter 2 talks about this empire having legs of iron. See how that matches up? And again, most commentators would say this is looking at Rome. Rome was characterized by iron. And its large iron teeth, and it crushed and devoured its victims, and it was different from the other beasts. And why? Because listen to this. It had 10 horns. Do you remember those iron legs? They had 10 toes, chapter 2. Now this beast has 10 horns. And again, I told you, the 10 horns are symbolic of the 10 leaders. Okay? And there was another little horn, and 3 horns were uprooted before it. This horn had eyes like a human being, and this horn had a mouth that spoke boastfully. And if you do my little chore for you when you go home and read Revelation 13, you not only read the first 4 verses, but in verse 5, it talks about this beast being extremely boastful. And I'll give you a hint. It's talking about the Antichrist. Okay? And then in verses 9 and 10, we see a different picture. Verse 9, he says, as I looked, thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days. Who do you think that describes? That describes God. The Ancient of Days took his seat, and his clothing was as white as snow. His hair and his head were white like wool. Those of you who tease me for my gray hair, it's a symbol of wisdom. And if you have white hair, it's the symbol of wisdom and authority. So none of this teasing about gray hair now. And some of you ladies color your hair to cover up your wisdom. Don't do that. So anyways, the Ancient of Days takes his place, and his clothing was white as snow. His hair was white like wool. The throne was flaming with fire, and the river of fire was coming up. This is a description, a visual description of the majesty of God's throne room. And he said, thousands upon thousands attended him. This is parallel to Revelation chapter 5, 4 and 5. And it talks about the courts. The court was seated and the books were opened. But then you go back to verse 11 and 12, and he's talking about what he talked about in verse 8. You see verse 8? He was talking about this little horn. And then verse 11 and 12, he continues talking about the little horn. Then I continued to watch because of the boastful words the horn was speaking. I kept looking until the beast was slain and its body destroyed and thrown into blazing fire. After the time of tribulation and after the time when the Antichrist persecutes believers, after that time, he is going to be thrown into the lake of fire. And that's what Daniel's describing here. So, he says, its body thrown into the fire, and the other beasts were stripped of their authority, but they were allowed to live for a period of time. Then in verses 13 and 14, he says, in my vision at night I looked. And then it says something amazing. Look at verse 13. One like a son of man. Do you know what Jesus used to describe himself 70 times in the New Testament? He called himself Son of Man. And you know what it means? Human being. That's what it means. He's a human being. But he says, look, one like a human being coming with the clouds of heaven. Now understand what it means when it says clouds of heaven. Clouds of heaven are something that go back to the early days of Israel's history. Do you remember when Moses was walking through the land of the desert with the people of Israel? Do you remember what God used to show them that he was leading them? He used a pillar of what? Cloud by day and fire by night. Do you remember that? And it was said in Moses' time that God was in the cloud. And God in the cloud led the people. And when the cloud stopped, the people would stop. When the cloud moved on, the people would follow the cloud. God was in the cloud. Now I want you to think of this. If God is in the cloud, and the clouds of heaven are coming, they expect God to be in the cloud. But when they expect God to be in the cloud, they look closer and they get their binoculars, and there's a human being in the cloud. And that human being has pierced feet and pierced hands. That human being is Jesus. Jesus, the Son of Man, appearing in the clouds of heaven. So that's what Daniel's seeing. One like a Son of Man coming, and he came with the clouds of heaven. And he approached the Ancient of Days, God, and he was led into his presence. And he was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All peoples, nations, men of every language, tongue, worshipped him. That's again what we see in Revelation. And his dominion was an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. What has Daniel just seen? He has seen 4 kingdoms that came up, seemed to be very powerful, and then were destroyed. And another kingdom came up, very powerful, destroyed. Another kingdom, very powerful and destroyed. Another kingdom, very powerful and destroyed. But Jesus has a kingdom that when he starts, it will never be destroyed. It will go on forever and forever. I'm sorry, I get excited about this stuff. So, Daniel is scratching his head. He's saying, I'm seeing all these images, but I don't really understand what they are. Verse 15 to 27 talks about what they are like. I, Daniel, was troubled in spirit, and the visions that passed through my mind disturbed me. I approached the one standing there and asked him the true meaning of all this. So he told me and gave me the interpretation of all these things. The four great beasts are four kingdoms that will rise from the earth, but the saints of the Most High will receive the kingdom and will possess it forever, yes, forever and ever. Then I wanted to know the true meaning of the fourth beast. He's not too concerned about the first three. He gets them. But he says, then I wanted to know the meaning of the fourth beast, which was different than all the others and most terrifying, with its iron teeth and bronze claws, and the beast that crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. I also wanted to know about the 10 horns on its head and about the other horn that came up before which three of them fell, the horn that looked more imposing than the others, and that had eyes and a mouth that spoke boastfully. As I watched, this horn was waging war against the saints and defeating them, until the Ancient of Days came and pronounced judgment in favor of the saints of the Most High. And the time came when they possessed the kingdom. He gave me this explanation. The fourth beast is a fourth kingdom that will appear on earth. It will be different from all other kingdoms and will devour the whole earth, trampling down and crushing it. The 10 horns are 10 kings who will come from this kingdom. After them, another king will arise, different from the earlier ones. He will subdue 3 kings. He will speak against the Most High and oppress his saints and try to change set times and the laws. And the saints will be handed over to him for a time, times, and half a time. But the court will sit, and his power will be taken away and completely destroyed forever. The sovereignty, power, and greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven will be handed over to the saints and the people of the Most High. His kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom. All rulers will worship and obey him. This is the end of the matter. I, Daniel, was deeply troubled by my thoughts, and my face turned pale, but I kept the matter to myself. So Daniel is curious about this dream. He says he's troubled, the visions disturbed him, and he asks for an explanation. And Daniel is given the interpretation. The 4 beasts, as we already talked about, the 4 beasts are 4 kings, or 4 kingdoms that will arise from the earth. The holy people of the Most High will receive the kingdom. Quick question. Who are the holy people of the Most High? Everyone who believes, Jew and Gentile. Jew and Gentile, Christians and people before Christians who were Jews, but believing Jews. Okay, and it says that Daniel asked for more information about the 4th beast. And it was different from the other. It was terrifying. And this 4th beast, most of us understand to be the Empire of Rome. There are some people who disagree, but that's the huge opinion. And he said, I wanted to know about the 10 horns. Now, there's something that happened. If you look on this document really quickly, my time's running out. There's a gap between these legs and the 10 toes. And there's a gap between the beast and its 10 horns. And the problem is, we cannot see directly in history 10 leaders that became so powerful as a unit. We can't see that anywhere in history. And because of that, we believe that the 10 nations or the 10 kings that work together, those 10 kings are still coming in the future. That's why we believe that. We can't see it in history, but we believe that Daniel saw it, and that means he must have seen it in something that is still yet future to us. All these other kingdoms are historical to us, but they were future to Daniel. But he saw so far ahead that he saw these 10 kings or these 10 horns or these 10 toes. So we believe that there is still coming a group of leaders that will be 10 in number. And these 10 leaders will have power over the whole earth. And these 10 leaders out of these 10 leaders will come leader number 11. And it won't be one of the 10, it'll be a new one. And that 11th leader will be the Antichrist. And that Antichrist, this little horn or this 11th leader, will all of a sudden, for a very short time, it says, time, times, and half a time. That's a Revelation type description of 3.5 years. So for 3.5 years, out of these 10 kings will come another king who will, for 3.5 years, will persecute the people of the Most High. That's why I don't believe in the pre-tribulation rapture. I believe that the rapture is going to happen before God's wrath, but not before the tribulation. The tribulation is when God allows the Antichrist to persecute believers. It says it right here. So this Antichrist will persecute believers for 3.5 years, and then God will say, that's enough, and he's going to bring his believers to be with him forever. So that's the interpretation that Daniel gets about these questions that he's asked. And then, I'm trying to hurry things on. Then the Ancient of Days, verse 26, will punish him. It says in verse 26 that the court will sit. Do you see that? What court is he talking about? It's the same court that he talked about in verse 9. The thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took its seat. He's talking about God's court, the court of heaven. He says, but the court will take place, and who's his? This Antichrist, this little horn. His power will be taken away and completely destroyed forever. The Antichrist is only going to rule for 3.5 years, and then he'll be toast. God will make sure of it. That's what Daniel's seeing. The little horn's power will be taken away, and he will be completely destroyed forever. The holy people, the people who the Antichrist was attacking, the holy people of the Most High will receive the kingdoms of the earth. And do you know what we believe happens after God's wrath is poured out in a sinful world? First of all, before God's wrath, the people are taken away. Then God pours his wrath on the world. And after that, you know what happens? It's called the millennium. It's the time when the people of God come back to this earth and they reign on this earth with Jesus Christ for 1,000 years. And Jesus reigns, and we just serve him. The Most High's kingdom will be everlasting. And this 1,000-year reign is just, it's kind of like the hors d'oeuvres when you go out to eat. It's the first glimpse of what heaven's going to be like. And when you have the 1,000-year reign of Christ on this earth, and then the old heaven and the old earth pass away, and the new heaven and the new earth, and he reigns forever and ever, that's the main course. The millennium's just kind of like the hors d'oeuvres, the testing. And the Most High's kingdom will be everlasting. All human rulers will worship and obey him. Isn't that beautiful? And Daniel says, at the end of this, I was deeply troubled in my mind. He said, this is too much for me to handle, but I'm so glad, I hope you are too, that he wrote it down so we could know it today. If God was actually speaking to Daniel for those first 4 kingdoms, if Daniel was accurate for those first kingdoms, don't you think he's accurate in what he said about the end? To me, it's very believable if what Daniel said in the first 4, or he received from God for the first 4, that he knows exactly what he was talking about for that which is still future to us. And that's why I believe in the future of the church, even though I believe we will be persecuted by the Antichrist. I believe we will not totally be annihilated by that. We will be persecuted, but there will come a day when we will reign with Christ here on the earth for 1,000 years and in a new heaven forever and ever. Let's pray. Dear Lord, this is an amazing truth that you have given to Daniel, and we thank you for it. And we pray that we would start to understand some of it, and then rejoice in the fact that you are going to reign forever and ever, and we get to be part of your kingdom. Thank you, Lord. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.